called How You Been? Here on Beats and Business with Phil Daly, and time for our guest for this afternoon. And Dr. David Cooke has released a book around about 12 months ago called Kind Business, How Values Create Value. Good afternoon, David. Welcome.
Hi, Phil. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you in here. Can you give our listeners a bit of a short overview of your background in the corporate world?
Yes, well, look, I spent about 35 years in the corporate world. In the 80s, I started at Xerox, which many people will be aware of course, global technology company. After some time in the 90s, I moved to Canon, another well-known brand, and I spent my last 15 years at Cooke,
a lot of copying.
A lot of copying, scanning, document management, and finished up at Cooke the last 8 years. I was the managing director there.
Okay. And that particular industry would have gone through quite a bit of change in the time that you were in those three different companies. Yes,
absolutely. And in a way, it's a sunset industry in terms of the hardware component. Yeah. Everything's digital now. There's not as much copying and printing of hard copies going on anymore. So as a managing director who was still tasked with making profit for shareholders in Japan, there were definitely challenges, but it was great. I enjoyed my time there.
And nowadays we frown if people are out copying, don't we? We sort of look and say, there's another tree coming down.
Yeah.
So while managing director of Cooke Minolta, you drove quite a significant program of cultural change. What were some of the main actions you took, and what motivated you to initiate these changes?
Right. Well, look, starting with the motivation first, I was a fairly unique appointment in that the company had been in Australia for 40 years. It would always been run by a Japanese person sent out from Tokyo, usually on a 4-year business visa. And I was the first non-Japanese managing director.
Wow.
It was announced at a conference in Sydney by a very senior Japanese person who'd come out, and he said, your new managing director is David Cooke. Nobody expected that. I was the general manager of sales, so they knew me, but and I walked up on stage and I turned to everybody, and I hadn't prepared a speech, but what came out of my mouth, first sentence as the new MD, was I want us all to work together to build a company that cares about the people who work here, that cares about our customers, and that cares about our community. The next day I walked into the head office for the first time as the new MD, and I wrote to everybody in the company and I said, look, you weren't all able to be at the conference, but this was my kind of vision statement, if you like. And there's only one problem. I don't know how to do it, and I need your help. Now, in many ways, that broke all the rules because I was a left field appointment, and probably the textbook would have said, well, you've got to steady the ship and show them that you're going to be a strong captain. You've got a plan already. You know what you're doing. I actually came out and I said, I don't know what I'm doing. So I showed a degree of vulnerability and maybe humility to some extent. And I sent out a questionnaire to everybody and I said, what do you want this company to look like? Let's build it together. And we got 800 responses to a voluntary survey. Nearly 95% of people, responded. And there was a very strong theme around purpose. They wanted more purpose. They wanted the company to stand for something, contribute to society. It was beautiful to see. They weren't focused on themselves. They were focused really on others. So I went back and I said, well, the theme of purpose keeps coming up. What is that? Let's unpack that. What does it mean to you? And we were very much behind in terms of like CSR, corporate social responsibility programs. We weren't very progressive at all. So we picked the low-hanging fruit, I guess, and we had them vote for who our charity partners should be in categories of social, environmental and health. And then we appointed a charity partner in a humanitarian category after a conference in Cambodia where we met young women who'd been trafficked, into the brothel systems of those capital cities over there, and had been rescued and were going through rehabilitation. So we added them into our charity partner portfolio, if you like, and we started to pay for them to be able to attend school and university and things like that. But that was the community pillar, if you like, the caring for our people pillar. We were one of the very first companies in Australia to get rid of the terms maternal and paternal leave and just call it parental leave. We put in the same leave provisions of 12 weeks paid leave, both for the birthing parent and the non-birthing parent. We were very early adopters of domestic violence leave. And we did something a little bit different, which I was criticised for, and I took on board the criticism but went ahead anyway. And that was, we had domestic violence leave for perpetrators within our organisation who came forward and said, I'm a perpetrator and I want to stop and I need help, I need counselling. We gave them leave.
That is quite adventurous in regards to taking on an initiative like that.
Yes, I think it was. And but we did some cutting edge things.
Yeah.
We did the things that we just felt were right. We didn't just follow.
What years are we talking about here, David?
We're going back about 10 years now.
Okay. So, and how would you, in hindsight, assess the success of this cultural change initiative?
Yeah, well, look, often cultural change, societal contributions are difficult to measure. In our case, I don't think it was. I think it was very easy. And if I looked at two categories, people and profit, dealing with people first, maybe a story will answer that question better than anything else. And that is that a short while after I'd been the managing director, I invited everybody in the company that had been there for 25 years or more to come to Sydney, and I took them out to dinner. And I just to say thank you for your loyalty to the company. You've been here longer than me. And at the end of the meal, one man said, could I please say something? And interestingly, everybody who'd been there that long was field service engineers, the people that come into your office and fix the device when it breaks down. They're the kind of the stayers, if you like. And this man hadn't spoken all night, a very quiet man. He stood up in this public restaurant and he made what I imagine was the first speech he'd ever made in his life. And he said, I've been here for over 25 years, that's why you invited me, and for that entire time I never told anybody where I worked. I just didn't see the point. It was just a job I went to. I did a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, and that's how I fed my family. Now I tell every single person I meet that I work for Konica Minolta. And why would I do that? He said, I do that because I feel so proud to work for an organisation that would care for young women on the other side of the world who've been trafficked into a life of sexual slavery. Now, if that isn't the most tangible benefit of a program of cultural reform, I don't know what is. On the profit side of things, because, business is about making profit and rewarding shareholders for their taking a risk with their money, we started to win a lot of big contracts with companies we'd never done business with before. And we weren't the best known brand. I'd worked for them. And they were generally the ones on the short list, not us. And I would go and I'd say to these people, look, we think you've made a fantastic decision in appointing us as your technology partner. But can you please tell me, why did you pick us? And invariably they'd say something like, look, we used to just assess tender responses on the product, the price, the service capability, and you're all pretty much the same. And it was a fair enough comment, actually. And then they would say, but now our own internal governance processes require us to look more deeply at who our vendors may be. And one man summed it up beautifully. He said, once we looked under the hood, we saw differences. And he said, all those companies are fine, by the way. But he said, what we saw was that you are putting in place initiatives inside and outside your company that really indicate where your values are. And we think your values and our values align, and we're a great fit for each other. So, and our business grew every year in a declining market between the global financial crisis and COVID. It grew every year for 10 years. where other businesses were naturally in decline due to the digital taking over from hard copy.
Now, you mentioned right at the beginning when you were announced as the new CEO of the organisation, you showed your vulnerability and you were initiating a change program. And most of us in large organisations are aware that probably 75 to 80% of change initiatives fail within organisations. Looking back on that now, it's very brave for a CEO and a new CEO to declare the vulnerability. What would you say about that?
Well, partly I didn't think about doing it any other way, because it just seemed to me that just be authentic, be yourself. Don't try and be the superhero at the top of the org chart that knows everything, because I didn't know everything. But I'm a huge believer, and my top tip of the day, if you like, would be, if you're running an organisation, leverage the strengths of everybody in the company. And that's what I attempted to do. I tried to give everybody a voice. And just to give a little plug, if I may, there's a local tech entrepreneur in Bangalore, Kylie Ingram. She's developed this fantastic app for business, which is available globally. It's called Wiser, W-I-Z-E-R. And what it is, the company will subscribe to Wiser. They'll get every single person in the company to put all of their information into this database. So, their education levels and their, work history and their skills and their strengths and their personality profile and so on. And then you can ask Wiser, which of course is powered by AI, any business question you like. So if you're about to launch a new product, you can say to Wiser, who should we have on the product launch team? Now, previously it might have been the same people in marketing every single time, and you get a bit of tunnel vision, a bit of echo chamber happening. But when you ask Wiser suddenly assembles this team, and you might find the receptionist will be seconded in, a technical person from the field that deals with customers, one salesperson, one finance person, and you leverage all of the strengths of the company. So I think all I did was I went to people and I leveraged all of the strength that we had within the whole company, not with a narrow vision.
Now, you've written a book called Kind Business, How Values Create Value, which seems to emphasise that profit and purpose can live side by side within a company. Why do you think that principle isn't more embedded, especially in our larger corporations?
Yeah, well, to me it's just kind of obvious, but we don't always see it. In fact, we don't necessarily see it a lot. We see it probably in smaller businesses, I think. And I think there's two main reasons. One of them is that people see profit and purpose at opposite ends of a spectrum, whereas in fact that's not true. They're part of a virtuous circle. The more profit you have, the more good you can do in society, and the more good you do in society, the more your business will flourish. So that's how I've always seen it. But the other thing is that the great curse of the capitalist system, I think, is short-termism. So when you get a CEO under profit pressure, under pressure to grow market share, etc., starting to focus month by month or quarter by quarter. And that's not the way to build a long-term sustainable business. And, McKinsey did a fantastic study, it was in 2023, where they took the Standard & Poor's 500, so basically the equivalent of our Australian Stock Exchange, 500 biggest companies in the US, broadly speaking, and they looked at them in 1958. So who was on the S&P in 1958? And how long on average had they been there? And the answer was 61 years. So on average, they started in 1897, if I've done the maths correctly. They then looked at the 500 who were there in 2023, and how long on average had they been in existence? And the answer was 18 years. So companies were disappearing at an alarming rate. Their business model was flawed. They were doing something that destroyed themselves. Capitalism was eating itself, and this was because of short-termism and a short-term focus. But then they extended the study and they said, well, what's it going to look like in 2027? And they determined that 75% of the companies on the S&P 500 in 2023 will have completely disappeared.
I'm talking today with Dr. David Cooke. He's the author of a book called Kind Business, How Values Create Value. We're going to go to a break and then we'll come back and continue this fascinating chat with David straight after this. And here on Beats and Business, and if you're interested in giving us some feedback, you can text us on 0437 341 119, and we'd be happy to hear from you. Just put your name at the end of the text. And today on Beats and Business, I'm talking to Dr. David Cooke, who's the author of Kind Business, How Values Create Value. Now, David, one of the things that you discuss in the book is compassionate leadership. What does that look like when I walk into a business, whether it's small or large?
Well, I think you feel it initially, and you can feel it in a business that really does care for the people who work there. I think it's palpable, actually.
Yeah.
And it comes down to companies' commitment to putting in place policies that will look after their people and, treat their customers ethically and so on. I'm actually an ambassador for an organisation called Family Friendly Workplaces, and organisations can engage with them and draw on their knowledge and expertise to put in place policies that will support people's lives and nourish them when they work there instead of depleting them by the end of the day. And family friendly doesn't just mean people with kids, it also means people with aged parents who need more flexibility to look after them. So I think compassion can really be replaced with caring, if you like.
And staying with that, I mean, I entered the workforce in the 70s and worked virtually for 50 years. Workplaces, as we know, are changing with particularly the different generations. Has that been a necessary change? Do you think we've been dragged kicking and screaming into a change? Or has that just been people saying we're getting more mature and more knowledgeable about what people want and therefore we're adapting our workplaces?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Look, I think there's some enlightened leaders who have been leading the charge, but I think, and this might be a slightly cynical comment, but I think to some extent businesses have been dragged kicking and screaming. I mean, I remember speaking to somebody that was in an HR role interviewing people for jobs, and she said to me, look, we don't interview the candidates anymore, they interview us. These younger people will ask us questions. Before I would commit to working for your organisation, I need to know a lot more about you. What sort of policies you have in place to support people? Would you be investing in my learning and development? Do you have corporate social responsibility programs, et cetera, et cetera? So to some extent, I think, businesses sort of sniffed the breeze and said, I think we'd better kind of change the way that we do things. And that's where some of the changes come from.
I understand tomorrow is celebrating 50 years of the Racial Discrimination Act being enacted, and it's one particular area that we've needed to look at in our society in regards to whether we're talking human rights. Is that something that people are more aware of now and therefore wanting to have that happening in their workplace?
Yeah, I think they are. And I think, again, in particular, younger generations are more concerned about society more broadly. And, of course, we have enormous access to information these days because of the net. And so we see what's going on in the world, and often we're horrified by that. And we would like to think that the companies we work for will be working for a better world, in particular, I think, to protect the rights of vulnerable people. And I do a bit of work and do a bit of public speaking around what's called modern slavery. And regrettably, there are more slaves in the world today than at any point in human history. So we can look at past generations and say, weren't they terrible to have those people from Africa kidnapped and working in those cotton plantations? Well, we are the worst generation, and more than 50 million people, often in corporate supply chains. And so I think business has a responsibility to ensure that the goods that they either purchase to use in their company or the goods they sell in their company are produced ethically, people are paid a living wage, and there's no forced labour in their supply chains. And I think more and more people that work in companies are demanding that of their organisation.
Now, we live in particularly turbulent times. Just look what's going on in Los Angeles at the moment over the last couple of days. And we see some companies, even governments, backing off in regards to diversity, equity and inclusion, or as they call it in the United States, DEI. Those are sort of initiatives, even retreating from sustainability programs. The resilience of even the staunchest components of these initiatives must be really tested currently. Do you have any advice for those listening today?
Yeah, I would say ramp up your diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives. This is not the time to back off them and be cowardly and retreat in the face of a particular world leader or others who may not understand the power of those initiatives. Because not only is it the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, to treat all people equally within your organisation, it's the smart thing to do. I spoke earlier about the fact that one of our great strengths and why we grew for 10 years every year was we leveraged everybody's ideas within the organisation. We didn't discriminate and say, oh, you don't have a fancy title, or you've only recently arrived in Australia, or your skin colour is this, or your gender is this. We asked everybody for their ideas in growing that company. I just think we are living in turbulent times, and the best way to deal with that is just to come back to who you are, that deep-centered quietness in yourself, and just stay true to your own moral code. Find your moral compass. What direction is it pointing in? If it's true north, stay true to that, and let the storm swirl around you, but anchor yourself to who you are and your values.
So, we grew up in a time, particularly if we talk the 70s, the 80s, we then had the internet. We used to look to the United States of America as far as aspiring to, as far as the way they ran organisations, even the way they ran their country. Do you think that's going to change?
I think it is changing, yes, and it might be part of our own maturation as a nation, where we see more pride in ourselves than having to, view others with pride and put them up on a pedestal.
True. Yep.
And I think the last federal election was a very, very interesting and resounding result. Where many people perhaps felt we would go the other way in view of recent events overseas, but that's not. The Australian people rejected that type of leadership.
David, thank you for coming and talking to me about your business, your book called Kind Business, and it's now available, How Values Create Value. If people want to get a copy of the book, David, where's the best place to go and pick up a copy or contact you?
No, they can pick up a copy from the book room in Byron in Lennox. They have stock.
Okay.
But any bookstore at all can get it in for them, and it's available through all the normal online mechanisms like Booktopia and so on. It's also an audio book, and it's an e-book for those who
an audio book.
Prefer to get their content in those ways.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if people wanted to get you to come in and talk to them in their organisation, is that something you're open to doing?
Yes, I do quite a bit of that sort of work. Look, I have a website. It's esgadvisory.com.au, and that's where you'll find me.
Well, it's been great talking to you today, David. It's been congratulations on your book.